Greetings, Professor and fellow students. My name is Patrick Dempsey, and I'm going to take over the presentation at slide 17 and talk to you briefly about Arctic business opportunities. In this portion of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about why businesses want to conduct business in the Arctic, why it's so attractive. I'm going to talk about how the stakeholder environment within the Arctic affects business operations. I'm going to touch briefly on how business operations affect the polar bear, and I'm going to touch briefly also on future development. So if you go to the next slide, on slide 18, basically resource abundance. The reason that companies and businesses want to exploit the Arctic and do Arctic exploration and conduct business there is because there's abundance of resources there. The main ones are oil and gas and minerals and fish, and they have a huge value. And as the ice continues to melt in the Arctic and environmental change takes place, businesses are going to be able to exploit more of these resources, get more of these resources, because they're going to have greater levels of access to these resources. And another industry that's going to probably grow is the shipping industry, because as ice continues to melt, some of these northern shipping passages are going to be open for larger periods during the year, and they can really cut distances with shipping worldwide, and they can, doing so can provide huge cost savings to businesses. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, everybody currently wants a piece of the Arctic due to high commodity prices and the availability of the resources. So there's a variety of stakeholders in the Arctic right now, and it kind of gets complicated, and this is why it's very important for businesses to work together, with governments and society to ensure that their business practices best align with a lot of the stakeholders. The circumpolar nations in the Arctic, Canada, Russia, U.S., Denmark, and Norway are the main ones. Finland, Sweden, and Iceland are also member states of the Arctic Council, but there's also a variety of other permanent observers, and these could be environmental groups or groups representing indigenous people. Currently, geographically, there is a dispute between territory in the Arctic between these Arctic states, and it's based on, interpretation of international law versus UN law of sea. And in international law, these nations have a 200-mile economic zone surrounding their territory, but the UN Law of Sea differs for that, and while the U.S. doesn't ratify the UN Law of Sea, other states are trying to gain more territory based on that law. So if you go to the next slide, the Royal Dutch Shell case, basically, in 2002, Shell was granted permission to drill. They had to spend a huge amount of money on regulations and permits, $4.5 billion, before they even got the first drill in the ground. And really their experience there has been a disaster. Due to weather, regulatory hurdles, fines, and lawsuits, they've been unable to conduct successful and profitable business operations in the regulatory environment and appease a lot of the different stakeholders that we just talked about. So as a result, their 2013 operations were suspended, and 2014 operations are questionable. And even the U.S. government really, acknowledges that their operations were a failure. So the next slide, 21, talking about the polar bear. In contrast to all the other stakeholders we talked about thus far, the polar bear really doesn't have much of a voice. The threatened status that is given by the U.S. really fails to fully protect the Arctic populations of the polar bear, and this has huge implications moving forward as business operations continue to grow, because the business operations could continue to disrupt natural habitat and further harm polar bear populations. The next slide, really organizations facilitating cooperation. There are a lot of organizations that are trying to facilitate cooperation between stakeholders, and a couple of the ones highlighted in red here, the Arctic Business Roundtable and the Arctic Business Leadership Council, are two organizations that facilitate the cooperation of big business, from different nations and different industries talking together and talking about sustainable development. And these are very important as we move forward from a business perspective with Arctic development. And finally, I just want to end saying that, we're at a tipping point in the Arctic. Will businesses work together with stakeholders to promote sustainable development? It's really a big question moving forward, whether business is going to align with these other stakeholders. And I would argue if not, if they don't align with other stakeholders, there could be some kind of tragedy of the commons that plays out in the Arctic area. As business activities increase, resources could be deployed. So corporate social responsibility is really a key here in the Arctic. businesses need to align themselves with other stakeholders and mitigate their risks well in the harsh environment of the Arctic when conducting business. I thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a nice day.